What if Simon and Garfunkel were LA melodic punk pioneers? That's the unlikely scenario we'll be unpacking on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hi, my name is Morgan Brown and each week I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel. The idea of these videos is that each week I pick a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely differently from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I have to hand in order to bring this alternative version of the song to life. So the song I picked this week was Bridge Over Troubled Water by Simon and Garfunkel, and I tried to reimagine that in a melodic punk style similar to Bad Religion's late 80s, early 90s material. If you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster.
I'll take your heart, and all it comes, and pain is all around, like a bridge over troubled water. I will lay me down, like a bridge over troubled water. I will lay me
I don't know if it's the same for everyone, but whenever I think of who the biggest acts of all time in music are, Simon and Garfunkel aren't necessarily one of the names that immediately pops into my mind. Obviously, you think of the Beatles, the Stones, Michael Jackson, Madonna, more contemporary people like Beyonce, Taylor Swift, etc. And Simon and Garfunkel wouldn't necessarily spring to mind, but actually they were unbelievably massive. And thinking back, I can't remember the first time that I heard Simon and Garfunkel, and it's not because the songs aren't memorable, it's just because there was such a presence that those songs were just always there in my life. Before I ever consciously listened to them, I just knew them through osmosis, really, from them just being there. I think that's probably quite a good indicator of how much of a part of culture that they became. Certainly as a duo billed as Simon and Garfunkel, they were only really together as an active recording group for a relatively short time and didn't release that many records, but those records are all pretty sensational, to be honest, and still stand up extremely well today. Obviously they've done reunion tours since, sporadically when they can get over their bits of backbiting and infighting that seem to inevitably crop up whenever they get together, but they've built a pretty amazing legacy based on just a small number of records, really. Of course, their partnership goes back quite some way before they really emerged in the public eye. They were school friends in Queens in the 1950s, and I think it was 1957 they actually recorded their first single as a duo, but not billed as Simon and Garfunkel. They were billed as Tom and Jerry. Recorded a song called Hey Little Schoolgirl, very much in the style of the Everly Brothers, who must have been one of their formative influences. It's a fun little pop song. I think probably a bit of a local success, but didn't exactly catapult them to stardom. They kept in touch, I think played together a bit, whilst also variously recording solo records under different names. Eventually reconvened as part of the emerging New York folk scene in the earlier 60s and cut their first album Wednesday Morning 3am just as an acoustic duo. It's a great record, it's got a lot of great songs on there, but somehow didn't cut through. It didn't have the kind of impact that some of their contemporaries in that New York scene would be having. And they were certainly never part of the top rank of that New York folk scene, along with your Bob Dylans and Phil Oakes and Dave Van Ronk and Tom Paxton and Joan Baez. Certainly never had that sort of political leanings of that scene so much, and maybe just seemed a little bit lightweight, maybe it seemed a little bit inauthentic to some of the people in that scene at the time, I don't know. But with that album coming out, not really doing much, Art Garfunkel goes off to college, and while he's doing that, Paul Simon relocates to England to just get involved in the folk scene over here in the UK, and while he's here records his first solo LP, Paul Simon's Songbook, which includes a lot of songs that will later become Simon and Garfunkel standards. Art Garfunkel finishes college and eventually Simon relocates back to the States and they reconvene as a duo. And in the meantime, Bob Dylan has gone electric and you've got the Byrds emerging. taking that folk sound and electrifying it as well. So all of a sudden folk rock is the hot thing. Tom Wilson, who was a very influential producer, like involved in Dylan's transition to electric work as well as a load of other stuff, he sensed that change was in the air around folk music. He saw the electric folk rock sound becoming the next thing. So having produced that first Simon & Garfunkel album, took the master tape of Sound of Silence and got in a session band to perform an electric rock band backing to the song. And that version of the song obviously becomes their breakthrough hit. I listened to it for years without realising that it was constructed in that way, but once you know, you can hear the backing kind of moving in and out of sync with the acoustic guitar and the vocals. It's not by any means a perfect job, but it certainly captured the public's imagination at the time. And then from that point on, they were really on a roll, and great string of albums. Bookends from 1968 has always been my favourite. That's the one that's got, among many other classics, Hazy Shade of Winter, which is probably my favourite of their songs. Also America, which is absolutely beautiful. Culminating in 1970 in Bridge Over Troubled Water, still one of the best-selling albums of all time. I mean, by that point, they were on pretty shaky terms in terms of their relationship, and sadly went their separate ways fairly shortly after its release. And as I say, there have been various reunions ever since, and both of them have had pretty interesting careers, especially Paul Simon, obviously, has gone on to quite spectacular success as a solo songwriter. Art Garfunkel's had some decent-sized hits and also a bit of a career in movies as well. But those records that they made together, there's just a magic, that combination of Simon's writing with Art Garfunkel's voice and the harmonies as well. There's just something really special about that, I think. I don't think I've ever heard either Simon or Garfunkel's views on punk rock. I can't particularly imagine that either of them was especially in favour of it. Although, I don't know, I always get the impression that Paul Simon's got kind of a bit of a prickly personality, and maybe a bit of punk attitude would have suited him. Certainly by the time they'd reconvened for the famous concert in Central Park in 1981, the hardcore punk scene, the real kind of second wave of punk after the initial 1976-77 outpouring, was in full effect. But I can't imagine that it particularly even registered on Simon & Garfunkel's radar. There was a hardcore scene developing in New York as early as 81, but as I think I discussed a few weeks ago in my Will Smith New York hardcore episode, it took a little while longer for that to really kind of gain a footing in New York, and at that point, around the start of the 80s, the real action in the development of punk rock was happening over on the other coast in LA. LA's initial wave of punk produced some really great acts. The Germs with Forming had one of the first West Coast punk singles, but they were pretty quickly followed by the likes of the Weirdos and the Alley Cats. A lot of the great bands on the Danger House label, The Eyes, all playing excellent kind of catchy, high energy punk rock, quite quirky, quite arty. As time goes on and the 80s are approaching, you start to see a newer wave of bands emerging on the West Coast, coming out of the LA suburbs with an approach that's altogether less arty, a lot tougher, a lot more aggressive, faster, harder, more nihilistic. I guess the move to a harder, faster style was presaged by bands like Rhino 39, songs like No Compromise, and The Middle Class, notably, who released the Out of Vogue EP pretty early on, and it's staggeringly fast for a 70s punk record. I think that was 1978-ish, and they're quickly followed by the likes of Black Flag, obviously, and the Germs, who I mentioned before, after they'd gone through a couple of lineup changes and kind of musically solidified a bit, released the Circle 1 EP and then the GI album, which are both foundational documents in this transition from the first wave punk rock into hardcore as well. So by the early 80s, there's a really thriving scene all around the Los Angeles area, with the overriding style being this fast, snotty, aggressive, quite nihilistic, driving punk rock. Which is not to say that that was the only thing that people were doing. I mean, as early as 1980, you've already got the Minutemen, who were shaking things up with this kind of funky, post-punky, really off-the-wall kind of exciting sound. You've got the Descendants, who are bringing in elements of kind of surf and pop music. So there are definitely people who are doing a bit of a variety of stuff, but the overwhelming overwhelming majority are playing relatively down the line hard and fast hardcore. And among them, you've got Bad Religion, whose early records are really in that mould. How Could Hell Be Any Worse is a classic example of that style of LA punk, really. That whole scene's going strong for a good 2 or 3 years there in the early 80s. Massively influential, and hardcore scenes that are springing up all across the rest of the US and the rest of the world. But the further you get into the 80s, the more people start to see the writing on the wall. People are starting to see hardcore as a bit of a musical cul-de-sac. A lot of the people who are involved in it have started to get a bit better at their instruments, started to get a little bit more adventurous musically, and started to think about other things that they could do. Or maybe they've just grown a little tired of playing that style of music and want to branch into other things. Their tastes have changed as they've got older, because I guess a lot of them started out as teenagers in these bands, and they're maturing a bit. So quite quickly, from sort of 1982, 83 onwards through the decade, you see bands who've typified this style moving on to other things. So TSOL, who were one of the leaders of that whole Orange County scene, go through an interesting gothic rock phase, and then somehow end up, after a couple of lineup changes, being a hair metal band. The Middle Class, who, as I say, were one of the kind of pioneers of the whole hardcore sound, they're one of the first bands who've moved away from hardcore. By the early 80s, they're playing this really atmospheric post-punk stuff. And then Bad Religion, who, as I say, have released How Could Hell Be Any Worse, which is a kind of foundational LA punk document. By their next album, again, they've had a couple of lineup changes and taken probably the most out there left turn of any of them in releasing Into the Unknown, which is kind of like a prog rock record. It's hard rock with strong prog elements anyway, which I don't think anyone could have seen coming from that first record. There's still some recognisable bits of the Bad Religion sound in there, but layered with keyboard and synth textures, much more involved songs, different tempos. And I think quite soon after releasing it, when they saw how people reacted to that album, they had some pretty severe regrets. So it's never been repressed, apart from, I think, in some kind of box set with all the albums. You've never been able to buy it again just as an individual record. All this is just to say that the mid-80s is a bit of a funny time for punk rock, and a lot of the bands who've been leaders of that scene have kind of moved away or broken up entirely. And Bad Religion did break up for a little bit there. I think they did the Back to the Known EP, which was an attempt to recapture their earlier sound, and then split up for a little bit. But by 1986, some of the personal issues that they've had with each other have sorted themselves out, so they reconvened. And the music they create obviously has clear links back to their initial sound, but it's also much more melodic. And they've added a new element, which is 3-part harmonies, which they refer to on all of the album liner notes as oozin. And Greg Graffin's voice, which on the first record is pretty much a standard kind of snotty punk rock bark, like you'd expect of any band of that generation. By the latter half of the 80s, it's really a much smoother proposition. And between that and the kind of melodies they're coming up with, there really is kind of almost a folky feel to what they're doing, even while they're driving along at this propulsive sort of discharge style hardcore pace. So that Suffer album, which eventually came out in 1988, really revitalised the West Coast punk scene, and it's probably one of the most imitated records in all of punk after the initial kind of 1976 wave. You can trace so much of what's happened in American punk rock since, right back down to that record and the couple of albums that they released after that. And as I say, Greg Graffin, particularly in the way he sings, the way he structures melodies, I think at heart he is a folk singer, and that's maybe what prompted me to think of trying to translate Simon and Garfunkel into this style. I know if you're familiar with Me First and the Gimme Gimmes, they've definitely already done West Coast melodic hardcore versions of a couple of Simon and Garfunkel classics, as well as some Paul Simon solo songs, but I don't believe they've done Bridge Over Troubled Water. I just really fancied having a go at it, so I thought of an alternative universe scenario which would explain how this existed. So in my alternative universe, most things are kind of the same as they are in this one, except Simon and Garfunkel was simply born 20 years later, so Instead of coming up in the 50s, they're coming up in New York in the 70s. And they start out just as an acoustic duo, playing kind of folk pop stuff. They're pretty oblivious to the punk scene that's happening there at the time. It's just not really on their radar. They're involved in other stuff. During the year of 1980, Paul Simon's passing a local record shop and just sees this album in the window and is really intrigued by it. Really stark cover, just a black album cover with a big blue circle on the front. And it's GI by the Germs, and just on a whim he buys it because he wants to hear what a band would sound like that would release a record that looks so striking. And he's completely blown away by this wild, aggressive, but strangely poetic music that comes out of the grooves. Plays it to his musical partner, and they're both taken with it, want to know more about where this is coming from, so they discover about the whole Los Angeles punk scene that's just really kind of kicking off at that point. Decide that that's the kind of music they want to play, and they figure the only way they can really get involved is to relocate over to the West Coast. So they do that. Duos don't really fit in with that scene, so they recruit a couple more members and become Simon and the Garfunkels and start putting out records which initially fall very much into the fairly standard, snotty, fast LA hardcore style that is popular at the time. The 80s rolls on, as I say, some of the bands in that scene start to diversify their sound. Simon and Garfunkel kind of stick with it, but their style evolves a little bit while keeping the punk underpinning. They start to hark back to some of the folk pop kind of stuff that they were doing back in the 70s, and eventually in 1986 they hook up with Brett Gurvitz's label Epitaph and release an album called Bridge Over Troubled Water, which combines the kind of fast aggressive hardcore style that they've been rocking with a more wholehearted embrace of the folk pop that they had previously left behind. And obviously Gurvitz hears this and is so taken by it that he reforms Bad Religion specifically to follow this path, and that's how the new Bad Religion sound is formed and thus becomes one of the most influential sounds in punk. So in order to try and convert Bridge Over Troubled Water to that particular musical mould, as ever my first step is just to take the original lead vocal, pop it into GarageBand and get it synced up to the grid. That was especially challenging this time because obviously the original performance, it's not done to any kind of metronomic time. It's very expressive, so there's a lot of push and pull with the tempos. So I had to do an awful lot of editing and shuffling bits around to get it to actually match up to the tempo grid, but I think I got there in the end. I then obviously had to speed it up quite a lot to just give it that kind of Bad Religion galloping speed. Next step was popping some drums on, so program some drums in, just going for a pretty kind of standard, almost D-beat-ish galloping rhythm with a few of the kind of signatures Pete Feinstone or Bobby Shea kind of dugga-dugga-dung fills that you get on all those things. A couple of little halftime sections as well, just for a bit of variety. Bass-wise, pretty simple. I've just got a nice kind of driving tone on there. Didn't do anything too elaborate. I just tried to make sure I hit all those really nice inverted chords rather than just hitting the root note all the way through. Guitar-wise, there's a couple of rhythm guitars just blasting out power chords, nice and straightforward, nothing too fancy there at all. And then as we go along, I added in a couple more guitars playing octaves in harmonies just to thicken out the sound and bolster it as the track builds towards the end. And then there's one further guitar just playing some little lead breaks in between verses. And the last ingredient that I needed was some of those oohs and ahs in the vocals. Obviously, in the third verse, Paul Simon does come in with a bit of a harmony, but for a Bad Religion-ish sound, I figured I needed at least a few more vocal harmonies, so I tried to just get a couple of little bits in there to just give it that kind of Bad Religion-ish three-part harmony in the chorus. Hopefully that doesn't sound too bad. I'm not much of a singer, and I can't really sing too loud in this flat because the walls are pretty thin, so a little bit shaky, but I think it sounds okay. Video-wise, there's not really a great deal of performance footage of Simon and Garfunkel from the time performing the song because they split up pretty soon after Bridge Over Troubled Water came out. I did find one clip of them rehearsing it, which is kind of annoying because the camera keeps panning off them and they also keep stopping singing in the middle of it, so I couldn't use all of that. But I used bits of that and combined it with a later performance of Art Garfunkel on his own. Since he's the main lead vocalist on the record, I thought that worked okay. Interspersed that with the guy from the Another State of Mind documentary who's demonstrating various punk dance moves. If you've not seen Another State of Mind, definitely check that out. It's one of the great early 80s West Coast punk documents, definitely worth a watch. We've got some 80s Bad Religion crowd clips, circle pits and the like, and there's also some clips from, there's a famous Bad Religion show where there's a riot and the riot police are called in, so I've got some just shots of the crowd outside that show milling around on the street looking a bit confused as the riot cops are kind of piling in, just to give a bit of a feel of what those kind of times were like. And then, as ever, intersperse that with a few of my standard dodgily mocked up concert posters at the time, with Simon and the Garfunkels inserted into various LA punk bills from classic 80s shows, just to give the impression that they're involved in that scene as well. So I hope you enjoyed this one. I had loads of fun doing it. It's kind of quite nicely in my wheelhouse, so I hope you enjoyed listening to it. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and if you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe. I always appreciate that. If you've got any suggestions for things that I can do in coming weeks, any artists you'd like me to take a look at, any songs you'd like me to try my hand at, or any styles you'd like me to investigate, please do let me know. I always appreciate those suggestions. I'll pop them down on the list, and if I can, I'll get round to them. But other than that, that's all from me for this week. So thanks very much indeed for watching, and I'll see you next time.